In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great defeated Babylon to unite much of the Middle East under Persian rule. As the new ruler of Babylon, he now controlled Judah, a land which had been conquered almost 50 years prior when Jerusalem had been destroyed. Rather than send another invading army to establish order in the southern kingdom, Cyrus chose a diplomatic approach. He issued the Edict of Cyrus. This document concerning human rights outlined the importance of temples and cultic sites for the people he conquered. The Persians then began sending former slaves from Babylon to settle in the land of Judah, where they can construct their temple and establish order and worship, under Persian guidance. The edict thus earned a place among Jewish scriptures in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and Ezra chapter 1, and Cyrus had earned his title of Messiah in Isaiah 45. I'm your host Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. 2 Chronicles begins with the tale of Solomon acquiring wisdom from Yahweh. This divine wisdom would become a defining trait of the temple-building king, so it makes sense that it's included by the chronicler. His source material was 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon has the chance to ask for wealth and power, but asks Yahweh instead for wisdom. Though as king, he already possessed wealth and power, and in choosing rightly, we know that he was wise as well. But the important part of this chapter isn't the inclusion of Solomon's wisdom, but the exclusion of his wife. The corresponding section in 1 Kings begins by telling us that Solomon had made an alliance with the Pharaoh of Egypt and married his daughter. Worse yet, Israelites were offering sacrifices at hilltop shrines, and verse 3 tells us Solomon did as well. This alliance with Egypt, his marriage to an Egyptian princess, and improper worship are all ignored by the chronicler and omitted from this part of the narrative. This includes Solomon's further idolatry from 1 Kings 11 when he marries hundreds of foreign women, the princesses from neighboring nations, and builds shrines for their myriad of gods in order to provide places of worship for them. Not only that, Solomon participates in the worship of these gods and goddesses, including Shamash and Asherah. This was, of course, the Deuteronomist way of explaining why their ancestors worshipped dozens of gods instead of following the now fashionable monotheistic religion they were attempting to impose on the residents of Judah. All of this is likewise excluded from the book of Chronicles. For the chronicler, his Solomon doesn't participate in idolatry, polytheism, or unholy alliances. Nor does he support or allow such behavior from his subjects. The only exception comes from 1 Kings 3:4, which is repeated in 2 Chronicles 1:3, when Solomon offers thousands of sacrifices at a hilltop shrine at Gibeon. The chronicler uses this as the occasion for catching Yahweh's attention so he can approach Solomon in his dream in order to make his offer to the king, which results in Solomon's receiving his famous wisdom. We're meant to understand that this is acceptable because the tent of meeting that Moses constructed for Yahweh was erected at Gibeon, but the chronicler fails to acknowledge that most mentions of worship at high places were also devoted to Yahweh. So this sacrifice at Gibeon isn't exceptional in any way. It's the same improper worship that gets the Israelites in trouble throughout the books of Kings. But here, we're supposed to ignore that. Another scene the chronicler skips is from the end of 1 Kings chapter 3. Verses 16 to 28 cover Solomon's wise ruling. In the story, 2 women come to Solomon with a problem. Each of them had a baby, but one of the 2 sons had died, and the 2 women were fighting over the living child, each claiming to be the boy's mother. Solomon asked for a sword so he could chop the baby in half, giving each woman a portion of the child. One woman cried out that she would rather see the child live with the other woman than leave with half a baby. Solomon concluded that this was enough evidence to prove that she was indeed the mother. I suppose he didn't consider the possibility that she wasn't the mother and just didn't think that the argument should end with infanticide, so she just dropped her case. Either way, everyone thought this was the most brilliant idea ever, and tales of Solomon's wisdom spread far and wide. I suppose the chronicler wasn't that impressed with the story either, so he omitted it from his record. He also skips the list of officers and functionaries from 1 Kings chapter 4. These don't have much to do with Levitical priests, so the chronicler doesn't find much use for them. The next section in 2 Chronicles is concerned with Solomon's plans for the construction of the Jerusalem temple. This draws upon 1 Kings 5 through 9, though the chronicler makes some interesting alterations. According to the Book of Kings, Solomon purchased the cedar and other supplies from King Hiram of Tyre. In 1 Kings 9:11, we read that he paid for these materials by trading 20 towns in the region of Galilee. But according to 2 Chronicles 8:2, Hiram gives 20 towns to Solomon. Apparently, the chronicler didn't like the idea of Solomon handing over towns to the king of Tyre, so he reverses that part of the transaction. This would mean that King Hiram paid Solomon 20 towns in the region of Galilee in order to take hundreds of tons of cedar off his hands. Yeah, that's not how trades work. Speaking of Hiram, his name is changed to Horamabi for some reason. It's almost as if the chronicler is blending Hiram with Hammurabi, the Babylonian lawgiver, though in some passages his name is Huram, so the chronicler isn't consistent with this name change. 1 Kings 5:13 tells us that Solomon conscripted Israelites and forced them to work on his temple construction project, some 30,000 men. However, 2 Chronicles 2:17 changes this to only Gentile workers. Forced labor for Israelites is distasteful in the eyes of the chronicler, but for non-Jews, there's no issue. So the Jews were meant to be free from slavery after Yahweh sent Moses to deliver them from Egypt, so the chronicler couldn't depict Solomon as an oppressor. Later in 2 Chronicles 8:9, the chronicler will explicitly state that Solomon didn't force any of the Israelites into his service. 1 Kings chapters 6 through 7 offers lists and descriptions concerning the building of Yahweh's temple and Solomon's palace. The materials used, the exact measurements of each section of each building, the decorations, and the ornamentation are all painstakingly recorded. And the chronicler, with his love of lists and details, especially where it concerns priestly matters, replicates these in 2 Chronicles 4 through 5. Despite copying much of these chapters verbatim, there are some discrepancies. Near the middle of 1 Kings chapter 7, we are treated to the description of wheeled stands adorned with bronze bulls, lions, and cherubim, and decorated with palm trees, lilies, and pomegranates. This section is conspicuously absent from the version presented by the chronicler. 2 Chronicles 4:5 comes from 1 Kings 7:26. The next verse, 2 Chronicles 4:6, however, picks up at 1 Kings 7:38. Everything from 1 Kings 7:27 to 37 has been excised. In the Second Temple period, imagery related to the chariot throne of Yahweh was suppressed, and the throne itself was absent from the temple in the post-exilic period. Imagery linking the temple with the Garden of Eden was likewise suppressed as part of the Deuteronomic reform. This appears to be a continuation of that trend. The symbolism was already downplayed when Kings was written, and the chronicler tidies up a few details that the Deuteronomist missed. We covered a bit of this in episodes 35 to 39. For more information on this transformation and the Eden imagery in the Jerusalem temple, see Margaret Barker's book, The Gate of Heaven. In 1 Kings 8, the Ark of the Covenant is brought to the temple to be placed alongside all the resplendent furnishings. This section is repeated in 2 Chronicles 5, but again we find small alterations. When the Ark is placed in the temple, a great cloud fills the space to denote the presence of Yahweh, just as the summit of Mount Sinai was consumed by smoke when Moses went up to visit his God. In Chronicles, however, Yahweh doesn't just appear in a cloud. He has to be summoned by the Levitical priest who provide a musical performance of Psalm 136 in order to invoke the deity. This shows the importance of the author's priesthood. If you want your patron deity to actually appear in the temple, you need the Levites to summon him. 1 Kings chapter 8 describes Solomon's dedication of the temple to Yahweh when the ark is installed within the Holy of Holies. The prayer he recites occupies nearly the entire chapter. But in 2 Chronicles, the prayer plays out a bit differently. Near the end of Solomon's prayer, the chronicler suddenly deviates from the source material in order to insert a favorite from the Levitical priest, more music. In this case, it's Psalm 132, verses 8 through 10, and verse 1. As soon as Solomon completes his prayer and the inserted musical number wraps up, there's suddenly a repeat of Elijah's fire from heaven miracle that we saw in 1 Kings chapter 18, in which the divine fire consumed the sacrifice which was offered to Yahweh. This reuse of Elijah's fire miracle didn't appear as a repeat to the chronicler, because he had no interest in those stories from the northern kingdom of Israel. Thus, no mention of Elijah and his sky fire were present in the Chronicles version of history. So the miracle is here, at the beginning of 2 Chronicles 7, attributed to Solomon instead of Elijah. 2 Chronicles 7:14 contains perhaps the most frequently quoted passage from the book of Chronicles. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. This sentiment is reflected in James 4:10, when the anonymous author of that letter writes, "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you." This passage is another of the chronicler's contributions, being completely absent from the source material in 1 Kings 9, where Solomon has his second vision of God at Gibeon. 2 Chronicles 8 finally speaks of Solomon's Egyptian wife. But rather than build for her a place of worship for her strange gods, we're told in verse 11 that Solomon constructed a house for her because, as a Gentile, she couldn't live in any place where the Ark of Yahweh had entered. Combine this with the complete omission by the chronicler of Solomon's worship of all the myriad gods of his many wives, and you might conclude he was a devout Yahwist as the Levitical author, rather than the filthy polytheist we saw in 1 Kings. In 2 Chronicles 12:15, we're treated to additional sources from which the chronicler drew, or perhaps fictive sources the chronicler names in an attempt to lend legitimacy to his narrative. These are the Chronicles of Shemaiah the prophet and the Chronicles of Iddo the seer. These are listed as additional sources for the life of Rehoboam, just as we saw in the books of Kings, when they ended the life of each king by stating that additional material may be found in the annals of the kings of Israel or Judah. It's unlikely these two new sources actually existed. The chronicler's sources for information are the books of Kings, and the majority of changes he makes don't seem to stem from lost sources, but from his own imagination, as the changes always reflect the transparent opinions of the chronicler himself. Another point to consider is how the chronicler uses these sources. He speaks of these kings and their great deeds, and then alludes to source material no other author has ever mentioned, and does so with phrases that hint at a great deal more concerning their lives, as if the many wonderful deeds couldn't possibly fit in the pages of his book. Or, as Dr. Robert M. Price puts it in his book, Holy Fable Volume 1, all such citations imply a literary device found in John 20:30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, and 21:25. But there are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Even when copying an attribution from the first book of Kings, the chronicler feels the need to change the sources. When the books of Kings reference the source book entitled The Book of the Kings of Israel, the chronicler changes that title to The Book of the Kings of Israel and Judah. Just compare 2 Kings 15:36 with 2 Chronicles 27:7. And just as the Book of Kings of Israel becomes the Book of Kings of Israel and Judah, so too does the Book of the Kings of Judah become the Book of the Kings of Judah and Israel, as we find in 2 Chronicles 25:26. So he has changed the name of two separate source books that were used in the books of Kings. But we know that he isn't using these books as sources. He's using 1st and 2nd Kings as his sources and then modifying the material to suit his needs, inventing sources along the way to bolster his narrative. 1 Kings chapter 11 introduces us to Jeroboam, the future king. But since he's an idolater, Chronicles skips this section entirely. You see, this section has Abijah, a Levite prophet, foretelling the kingship of Jeroboam, and the chronicler wishes to distance himself and the Levitical priest in general from anyone who worships the old gods of their ancestors. He does copy most of Jeroboam's wickedness from 1 Kings 12 faithfully, telling how the man led the northern kingdom of Israel astray. He just removed Yahweh's hand in elevating Jeroboam to the throne from his narrative. He also chopped out the centers of worship established at Bethel and Dan by Jeroboam. No need to advertise that cultic centers which rival Jerusalem exist in the world. These centers had been established as worship sites for Yahweh, where faithful Levite priests practiced, but the story, as we have it now, claims they replaced Yahweh with heathen gods. Another detail of note is that the temples at Bethel and Dan weren't operating simultaneously. Bethel was constructed to replace the temple at Dan as the central northern temple to Yahweh when the Assyrians destroyed the temple of Dan. But then Bethel was likewise destroyed, so worship shifted to Dan once again until Dan was once again destroyed and was again replaced by Bethel. All of this occurred centuries before the chronicler was born, so we can forgive him for not knowing. He then skips all of 1 Kings 13 and the first half of 14, picking up again in 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 21, so he can blast Rehoboam for his idolatry and the wickedness that spread through the northern kingdom during his rule. Returning to the old ways of worship from before the time of the reforms is here presented as foreign ideas from those filthy Canaanites, ignoring the fact that the Israelites were Canaanites and that these religious practices weren't foreign at all, but the native practices of their own ancestors. We find a reference to the fact that Israel had worshipped other gods in Joshua 24, and this worship continued while they were under Egyptian rule. Abandoning polytheism is a requirement of Yahweh for giving them the land and the Torah. And their learning of Yahweh didn't occur until the time of Moses. So according to that tradition, the Israelites weren't monotheists who had slipped into paganism, but pagans who eventually learned about a national deity they came to worship to the exclusion of all others. The invasion of Pharaoh Shishak is explained as divine punishment for Rehoboam's sins. This comes from the prophet Shemaiah, created by the chronicler for just this occasion. He convinces King Rehoboam to repent, and when he does, Yahweh causes Shishak to relent, but only after he loots the temple and Judah is still made a vassal state. This is where the Chronicles of Shemaiah come into play. The chronicler uses this fictive source to lend legitimacy to his addition to the tale. Chapter 13 of 2 Chronicles introduces us to Abijah, Rehoboam's son. The source material in 1 Kings chapter 15 tells us he too was an idolater, but for the sake of David, his ancestor, he wasn't punished as those northern idolaters were. But the chronicler has other plans. Abijah's idol worship is completely expunged from 2 Chronicles 13, and he's granted a miraculous victory over Jeroboam's army. when Levitical priests blow their trumpets and Abijah's troops summon Yahweh to assist them in battle. So Abijah went from an idolater who was spared the wrath of Yahweh to a pious man who faithfully served the Levitical priest and was rewarded with divine victories in battle. We move on to Abijah's son Asa, who succeeded him as king of Judah in 1 Kings 15, where he expelled the priestly prostitutes and removed all the idols that his ancestors worshipped, which made him pleasing in the eyes of Yahweh. The Asherah poles were cut down and burned in the Kidron Valley. To this, the chronicler adds a war with Zerah the Cushite, who invaded Judah with 1,000 times 1,000 soldiers, so 1,000,000 people. And Asa, with a third as many men, met the Cushites in the valley of Zephathah and destroyed them all simply by asking Yahweh to help. We're told that the terror of Yahweh had fallen on them, and all 1,000,000 people died. There's no source for this highly improbable event, and no historian or archaeologist has ever discovered a mass grave containing 1,000,000 corpses, so it's safe to say this scene is just another example of the chronicler rewriting an already fictive history. There's a bit of strangeness in 2 Chronicles 15 when the prophet Azariah compels Asa to destroy the altars and Asherah poles throughout the land, the same ones that had already been destroyed before the battle. So Asa reformed the religion of Judah twice in the book of Chronicles, and no one seems to notice that the altars and idols just kept growing back, not even the chronicler himself. After this, Asa is attacked by Baasha just as he was in 1 Kings, and just as he did in the previous book, Asa used temple gold to pay off his attacker. But since the chronicler had inserted the miracle battle into Asa's story, he didn't appreciate the use of temple treasures as war tribute. He has Yahweh punish Asa for not relying on his patron god to dispatch Baasha, as he had done with the Cushite army. He also curses Asa with a foot disease that is mentioned in 1 Kings 15:23, but the chronicler again insults Asa by stating that he had again doubted God and resorted to physicians instead of relying on faith. From that time on, the chronicler makes no further mention of the northern kings like Baasha or the Omrides. Everything from chapters 14 to 21 of 1 Kings were omitted. If only the chronicler's version had survived, then kings such as Elah and Zimri would be absent from the Israelite history, removed by the chronicler when he had no political or theological use for them. The dealings of the northern kingdom of Israel are of no interest to the author of this book. Moving on to chapter 18, we find that the chronicler copies the details of King Jehoshaphat verbatim from 1 Kings 22, and then invents a list of great deeds for the king in chapter 19 of 2 Chronicles, which have no basis in his source material of 1 Kings. He travels from Beersheba to Ephraim to convert people to Yahweh worship, and appoints a judge to preside over each fortified city in the land, setting them to the divine task of judging for Yahweh. He appointed Levites, of course, to settle disputes in Jerusalem. Then an invasion force marches on Judah, and Jehoshaphat keeps faith and asks Yahweh for help. The Spirit of Yahweh speaks through Jahaziel, the son of Zechariah, and begins by saying, "Be not afraid," meaning the Spirit was probably a bunch of wheels and wings and animal heads and horrible stuff like that. He then told Jehoshaphat to gather his army and march toward the invaders, but there's really no point in doing that because Yahweh himself was going to solve the problem and the men of Judah wouldn't actually participate. Levites did a lot of singing and playing music, of course, and the people celebrated. And the singing of the Levites actually prompted Yahweh to perform the miracle that defeated the enemies of Israel. So the author's priestly class are, of course, the most important people in the story, and the soldiers didn't really do anything. Yahweh had the invaders turn on one another, and the slaughter began. By the time the men of Judah reached the mountain passes, there were only dead bodies to plunder. so much so that it took 3 days to collect all the loot. This story serves as an ideological tale for the Valley of Barakah, which means Valley of Praise. One more detail of note before we move out of this mountain pass through which the invaders marched. It's called the Pass of Ziz. Longtime listeners will recognize this name. Ziz is the gargantuan primordial bird that lived alongside Leviathan and Behemoth. Where those kaiju ruled the sea and land respectively, Ziz ruled the sky. It's referenced in Psalm 50 and Psalm 80 and might be the Israelite parallel to Anzu, the Sumerian creature also called the Zu bird, which likewise flew off to live in a high mountain pass. In the legends of Rabba Bar Barhana, the Ziz is so tall that its head reaches into the heavens, and its legs to the bottom of the ocean. Like the Leviathan and the Behemoth, it will be slaughtered and served up in a grand buffet to the sons of God and the righteous at the end of time. In 1 Kings 22:48, Jehoshaphat constructs a fleet of trading ships to bring gold from Ophir, but before they can, they are wrecked. Afterwards, King Amaziah of Israel offers to lend men to sail with the ships, but Jehoshaphat refuses. Here in 2 Chronicles 20:37, the story is a bit different. In the Chronicler's version, Jehoshaphat forms an alliance with Amaziah of Israel, something not mentioned in the source material of 1 Kings 22. Because he sided with a wicked northern king whom Yahweh had rejected, Jehoshaphat's fleet was doomed, and this was foretold by the prophet Eliezer, who was invented by the Chronicler in order to transform a story of maritime disaster into one of righteous retribution. Because you have made an alliance with Ahaziah, Yahweh will destroy what you have made. So he went from building ships on his own, losing them to shipwreck, and then refusing an alliance with Ahaziah, to forming an alliance with King Ahaziah, constructing ships with his wicked allies' help, and then losing the ships to divine punishment after being warned by a prophet never before known in the tale. The Chronicler skips the first 7 chapters of 2 Kings and the first half of chapter 8, omitting such stories as Elijah calling down fire from heaven to torch the soldiers, Elijah's ascension into heaven in a flaming chariot, Elisha crossing the Jordan, Elisha purifying the waters, Elisha summoning the she-bears to eat children, multiplying the jars of oil, resurrecting the dead Shunammite boy, healing Naaman of leprosy, defeating the Arameans, retrieving a lost axe head, the siege of Samaria, and restoring the land to the Shunammite woman. He picks up the thread with the reign of Joram, and it's found in 1 Kings 8:16 and is copied into 2 Chronicles 21. The chronicler adds to Joram's account the sin of constructing hilltop shrines in 2 Chronicles 21:11, along with leading the people of Judah to prostitute themselves. He's also warned by Elijah the prophet, who should be dead by this point, that his sins will bring punishment from Yahweh. This comes in the form of raids by the Philistines and Arabs who invade Judah and even loot the king's palace, carrying away his wives and children, leaving only his youngest son, Ahaziah. Finally, Yahweh cursed Joram with disease which caused his bowels to erupt from his body, killing him in great pain. None of these details are found anywhere in the source material of 2 Kings chapter 8. It's all invented by the chronicler. Why? Because Joram committed idolatry, and since the source material of 2 Kings didn't mention punishment for the crime, the chronicler felt that someone had to. He couldn't let the king get away with it, now could he? The deeds of Jehu of Israel are omitted because he's a northern king, so multiple chapters of his Yahwistic zealotry are summarized in just a few sentences that stated he assassinated a few enemies. In 2 Kings 11, Joram's grandson Joash is rescued by his aunt Jehoshaphat, who hides him away so his grandmother Athaliah can't have him killed. Years later, the priest Jehoiada conspires with the palace guards to seize the throne for Joash and put Athaliah to death, thus ending the reign of the wicked queen. But in 2 Chronicles 22 to 23, it isn't the palace guards who do all the heavy lifting. Instead, the chronicler has them replaced with, you guessed it, Levitical priests. The same priests who excused themselves from battle are now roaming the halls of the temple and the palace, rounding up those who oppose them, including the queen herself, and putting them to the sword. The material from the next few chapters of 2 Kings is skipped by the chronicler, including the death of the prophet Elisha and the reign of Jeroboam II, as those stories concern the northern kingdom of Israel. He picks up the thread again in 2 Chronicles 25, which retells 2 Kings 15. The account is mostly the same, but the chronicler adds a few verses to further cast King Amaziah in a poor light. He's already a sinner in the eyes of Yahweh for not removing the hilltop shrines. So the Levitical author adds to the narrative a bit in order to further insult the king. In the next chapter, the chronicler does something similar to the story of King Uzziah. He had done what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, but like his father Amaziah, he too neglected to remove the hilltop shrines, so Yahweh cursed him with leprosy for his entire life. But the chronicler decided the king had committed other sins as well, despite there being no mention of them in his source material. So he inserts a few verses in 2 Chronicles 26:16-20, explaining that Uzziah was also prideful and sinned against Yahweh by marching into the temple and offering incense on the altar, a task which was reserved for the Levitical priest. This is simply the author's way of saying, if you think you're as good as us, Yahweh just might smite you with leprosy. 2 Kings 17 tells of the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel. But the chronicler isn't concerned with the northern kingdom, so the greatest defeat in their history is omitted from this version of Israelite history entirely. His focus is on the southern kingdom of Judah. Israel might as well be Egypt for all the chronicler cares. So this portion of the source material finds no representation in 2 Chronicles. 2 Kings 18 recounts Hezekiah's reforms and purification of the Jerusalem temple, a subject the chronicler is keenly interested in. Not only does he record the episode in 2 Chronicles 29, he adds lots of Levitical details to the story. You want lists? Chapter 29, verses 12 to 24, lists Levites who were sent to minister to the people, naming the lineage of each, of course. The next few chapters pad the resume of King Hezekiah and add more details that only Levitical priests would consider important, such as how exactly the sacrifices were performed, the precise manner in which they celebrated Passover, the types of contributions offered by various people, etc. What was told in 16 verses of 2 Kings chapter 18 occupies 3 entire chapters of 2 Chronicles, chapters 29, 30, and 31. But what's interesting isn't what's been added, but what has been removed. In the Jerusalem temple, priests had once made offerings to their serpent god named Nehushtan. As they drifted towards monotheism, they attempted to explain why they had a massive bronze snake statue that the people worshipped. So they inserted stories into their fictive history which gave this statue a Yahwistic pedigree, such as the tale in Numbers 21, in which Yahweh commands Moses to build the snake altar to save the people from Yahweh. Originally, this story was about the healing power of the serpent god and the shrine associated with him. Once Yahweh was added to the tale, it made very little sense, but it did explain why they worship snakes in Jerusalem. But the author of 2 Kings didn't much care for the snake god and felt that claiming it was a tool for Yahweh wasn't enough, so he had Hezekiah toss Nehushtan out on his ear. If snakes had ears, that is. But for the chronicler, that isn't enough. The notion that the Israelites were worshiping a serpent that was mentioned in the Garden of Eden inside the Jerusalem temple was just too much, so he omits it entirely. The Assyrians finally make their appearance in 2 Chronicles 32, which draws upon 2 Kings 18 and 19. King Sennacherib invades Judah and conquers most of the cities and besieges Jerusalem. Not content with threatening the citizens, King Sennacherib also mocks Yahweh by stating that no gods have successfully repelled the Assyrian army, so Hezekiah would be a fool to rely on Yahweh. 2 Kings 18 tells us that Hezekiah offered a bribe to Sennacherib, stripping the silver and gold from the temple and emptying the royal treasury to buy his safety. We know from the Assyrian account that this actually occurred, but according to the biblical account, the Assyrians still attempted to invade the city, at which point Yahweh sent an angel to kill 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. This account of the Assyrians attempting to invade after accepting the bribe from Hezekiah was added to the episode to set up for a grand miracle from Yahweh, who, according to the Deuteronomist, is quite active in the national affairs of Israel. But the chronicler likes Hezekiah too much for this. He takes a different approach. Rather than Sennacherib besieging the city, receiving the bribe, and then attempting another invasion, he removes the bribery account entirely and replaces it with 2 Chronicles 32, 2-8, which depicts Hezekiah as a military genius who strengthens defenses and reduces the availability of water for the invading army well in advance of the siege. So instead of begging the Assyrians for mercy and stripping the temple to pay them off, this version of Hezekiah doesn't know the meaning of fear, and his military prowess is so great that he almost doesn't need the angel of death to kill all those people. It's a complete reversal of the narrative. As good as Hezekiah was, his son Manasseh was equally wicked. 2 Kings 21 tells us that he rebuilt the hilltop shrines, practiced idolatry, worshipped the sons of God, installed a new Asherah pole in the Jerusalem temple, consulted seers, shed innocent blood, and even sacrificed his own son. Despite all this wickedness, he reigned in Jerusalem for 55 years. The chronicler wasn't much pleased with such a terrible king enjoying such a long reign, so he imagined that something must have happened to set the king right in the eyes of Yahweh. Otherwise, he couldn't have reigned for so long. We find the result of his imagination in 2 Chronicles 33, beginning around verse 10, when Yahweh tries to get the king's attention. When Manasseh ignores him, Yahweh sends the Assyrians to capture him, bind him in chains, and drag him off to Babylon, where he sees the light and repents. His pleas are so heartfelt that Yahweh is moved and personally brings Manasseh back to Jerusalem, where he resumes his rule. Manasseh then rebuilt the outer wall of the city of David and fortified the cities of Judah. He then removed the foreign gods and idols in the Jerusalem temple and restored the altar. All of this is completely the invention of the chronicler. King Amon continues the abominations of his predecessor, but according to 2 Chronicles, Manasseh had renounced his wicked ways, so the chronicler has Amon reinstate the idolatry that Manasseh had renounced. This put the tales of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles back in agreement. The land of Judah is filled with idolaters once more, so that Josiah can reform the land just as Hezekiah had done. Now that the tale is once again in agreement with Kings, the chronicler follows the story to the end of this portion of history, with the fall of Jerusalem and the exile in Babylon, as is told in the book of 2 Kings. One final detail to examine before we finish this episode comes in 2 Chronicles 36:23. Yahweh is called the God of Heaven. This is noteworthy, as this is not a title that has ever before been used for Yahweh. He's sometimes called Lord of Heaven, or Lord of the Heavenly Army, or Lord of Hosts, etc., but this specific title, God of Heaven, isn't found in any prior piece of Jewish literature. It makes its first appearance here, in a verse that introduces King Cyrus of Persia, the new Jewish Messiah, as king, anointed by Yahweh to rule over all the lands of the world, Judah included, and the man who will construct a grand temple in Jerusalem. So what has Cyrus the Great of Persia to do with this strange new title for Yahweh? The title of God of Heaven is one of the many titles associated with the Persian god Ahura Mazda. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you'd like to support the show, there's an Amazon wish list in a pinned post on my Facebook page. The books in that list help with research for future episodes. You can also shop the merchandise from my Zazzle store, which can also be found on that same post. Just visit facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. And you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/dragonsandgenesis. If you have any questions regarding mythology and the Bible, send them to me at dragonsandgenesis@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer your question in a video on my YouTube channel, over at youtube.com/dragonsandgenesispodcast. Don't forget to give a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and check out the site at dragonsandgenesis.com for links, episode information, and a list of recommended reading. And as always, thank you for listening.